So let's just plunge into part one, which is about time, measurements of time. Let's talk about the week. Outside, I know what this book says. In 7 days, God created the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested on the seventh day. So I know that. Outside of the book, what do we have for the week? What evidences do we have of the existence of a week?
Well, the earliest evidence historically that we have comes out of the Sumerian civilization,
All right.
which disappeared 2,000 years before Christ.
Okay.
Right? So they had a 7-day week. And historians say that their 7-day week really was based upon the fact that they could look up in the sky at night. Well, not just at night. They could look up in the sky and see 7 different moving objects.
And that's how they got the 7 days?
And that's how they got the 7 days. Because they would include the sun and the moon, and then the 5 visible planets.
Gotcha.
You know, they could see Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Mercury, and Venus. So there were their 7. When they disappeared, the Sumerians, that is, not the stars. When they disappeared.
Hallelujah.
Yeah, right. Then that was the era then of what we would call the classical Babylonian Empire.
All right.
And they got their 7-day week from the Sumerians. They sort of inherited that. Right? So we have that early evidence. Now, of course, that does take us back. If we go back to Sumerians, that takes us back into the time, really, of the flood and post-flood.
Okay.
So that's pretty early evidence of the week.
Now, do you have societies that are actually embracing a different length week?
Well, among those societies that tried to manage their life based upon the phases of the moon, and this was the typical thing. So their weeks were kind of haphazard. All right, really is not outside of the scriptural record that we have this unending 7-day cycle that's totally separate from the phases of the moon. But other societies had other lengths of time. For example, the Romans had a market week, which was 8 days long. I don't know if you really call it a week, but it was a market cycle. All right.
A repeating cycle, 8 after 8 after 8
exactly,
after 8.
Exactly.
Okay.
But it all had to do with markets. All right. That really didn't have to do with anything in the sky.
Because the Egyptians experimented for a while. Well, maybe not experimented. Were they on a 10-day week?
Well, the Egyptians differed a little bit from those who had gone before them because the Egyptians had an astronomical year. They followed the sun rather than the moon. All right, so
they're not lunar-based at all.
So they are not lunar-based at all. All right, and they are not planet-based the way that, for example, the Babylonians of Daniel's time, the Chaldeans were.
Okay.
All right, so the Egyptians had a 10-day week, if you can call it a week. But what they would do, if you take 10 months.
Wait a minute. Can you imagine having to work 9 days before you get a day off?
Yeah,
So you get a day off.
Don't introduce this concept to society today, please.
Well, you know, the reason you can't call it a week, by the way, is because the term week in the Bible was the same term as 7.
Exactly.
You know, it meant 7, so.
So it would not technically be a week at all.
It was actually more like a decade.
Okay.
See, what they had was this. They had a year of 12 months of 30 days each.
Okay.
All right.
360-day year.
Yeah, and then each of those months was divided up into 3 parts, 3 10-day parts.
All right.
But then they'd come to the end of that cycle. Just think about it. 12 times 30.
Yeah.
That's 5 days short of a typical year. That's only
that we're
360
used to.
days.
Of a
All right.
solar year, right?
Yes, of a solar year. So they would then add those extra days that were not part of their calendar as basically like as holidays or feast days. So even though they had a 10-day quotes week, they still didn't have a continuous cycle.
So the Jews, and by the way, there are no Jews in Genesis 1. The story of creation is not a story of the birth of the Jewish people. They're the children of Abraham, correct?
Right.
Yeah. Because I make that point because some people say, well, the Sabbath and the weekly cycle, that's a kind of a Jewish thing. No, it's a according to this document, it's a human thing.
That's right.
Right.
But the children of Abraham and on into the time of Christ, the Jews had a 7-day week. Never deviated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was actually a God thing.
Yes, it was. I mean, you're right. It's a good point, Jim.
Right.
Tell me about the Jewish calendar. Okay, so we know their weekly cycle. Jesus lived with a weekly cycle of 7 days. But what kind of a calendar were they under?
You know, I can't really answer that question, Dwight, because it was such a complex calendar that the ordinary people didn't really calculate things by a calendar. They were told by their leaders what was happening calendar-wise.
Passover has come, and so now we know it's that time of year.
You know, the year began when they were told it had begun by the rabbis.
I'd like to explore with you both this Julian calendar, because now we're going to move from the weekly cycle to the yearly cycle. Tell me about this Julian calendar.
Well, it of course goes back to Julius Caesar.
Okay.
All right, and Julius Caesar engaged the services of an Egyptian astronomer. The calendar, the Roman calendar at that time was in, as far as he was concerned, was in disarray. So Julius Caesar wanted to establish a calendar that would be in sync with the seasons, that would not drift through the seasons, as it were. All right?
Because of the extra days.
Because of the fact, you know what, it was all about trying to make the month and the year work together. And this has been the battle that people who've tried to make calendars have fought ever since the beginning, to make the cycles of the moon and the orbit of the earth around the sun somehow match up. And you know, it's actually impossible. So what Julius Caesar did was to establish a calendar that allowed for the fact, first of all, that the year could not be evenly divided up into days. In other words,
Not a nice, neat package.
365 days is not a year. Of course, 366 days is not a year either. So it was in his plan to have a year that would be accurate based upon the seasons. I guess we could call that actually what we would call a tropical year, all right? So that the beginning of the year, if the year was going to begin in springtime, it would always begin in springtime. It wouldn't drift from spring eventually around to fall,
All right.
okay? So he established a year that was 12 months long, that had months of either 30 or 31 days, that had a way to adjust for the inaccuracy in a 365-day year. In other words,
how did he make that adjustment?
well, he obviously did it with the leap year.
So the Julian calendar
So the
has a leap year.
Julian calendar has a leap year. All right. That was the calendar that was beginning to be used in the societies under the influence of the Romans. So that would have been the calendar, general calendar at Jesus' time.
But he isn't tampering with a weekly cycle. He's not taking a Sunday and putting it after Wednesday. I mean, the names of the weeks, of the days rather. He's not tampering with the weekly cycle as such.
No, because now the Jews had their weekly cycle in which the days were basically numbered. All right. There was
First day, second day, third
exactly,
day.
exactly.
And they numbered it, you know, the first day toward the Sabbath, second day toward Sabbath, third day toward, you know. So the Sabbath was the culmination of this 7-day cycle.
Which, by the way, let me just insert this before I forget it. You have, you mentioned it a moment ago, Jim, there is the solar year based on this a celestial body. And the solar year is the Earth's
Orbit. Yeah.
once, right?
Once.
And then you have the lunar month, and the month is the rotation of the moon around the Earth, generally.
The apparent cycle of the moon. That
Yes.
yeah.
But the Jewish method, the 7-day cycle, is not tied to any celestial cycle at all.
No.
It's just 7 days, which says something, perhaps, does it?
Well, of course, it's all focused on the worship of God, because it's all these days are leading up to Sabbath, and then you start that cycle again. And
So nobody could say, well, this is a natural phenomenon,
Right.
because
Right.
it's tied to Mars doing this. No, it's not tied to anything.
That's why it's so interesting that they find a 7-day cycle in our biorhythms. You know, actually in our bodies we have
Isn't
some
that
kind
amazing?
of a 7-day
What
cycle.
about that 7-day cycle? Where in our biorhythms do we see that?
well, primarily, in fact, I don't even know if this is primarily, but one good example is the fact that it is well known that the rejection of organ transplants, that rejection peaks at 7-day intervals. Now, I'm not sure what that means, but it is interesting that it exists.
I want to get back to the Julian calendar.
Yes.
Because people say, well, you know what? I mean, you know, how do we know which day of the week is the first day? I mean, maybe the days all got changed. But when the Gregorian calendar comes, does it tamper with the 7-day cycle?
No, and by the way, we should point out too that the Julian calendar itself was really a separate issue from the 7-day cycle. All right.
It's a solar year.
It's a solar year. That it's a calendar that takes into account both the sun and the moon.
Okay.
All right. And is clearly divided up into months.
Then why did they invent the Gregorian calendar?
Well, the Gregorian calendar is actually a correction of the Julian calendar.
All right.
All right. Because the Julian calendar, even though it had a leap year, see, even with that leap year, that 4-year cycle, three what we call ordinary years, and then the leap year, all right, that ordinary cycle of 4 years is still inaccurate.
And by the way, that was before they invented the Rolex watch.
Yes.
Isn't that right? And so there's nobody looking at his watch and saying, you know, we're 11 minutes off.
That's right.
But they calculated it.
It actually comes out to be 3 days every 400 years.
3 days every 400.
Doesn't sound like much, does it?
Isn't that something?
But
So that's
three
what the
extra-
Gregorian calendar adjusts.
Well, here's the background of that story. The church in 325 kind of officially adopted the Julian calendar
All right.
into its liturgical calendar. All right? And the idea was that Easter would always be tied to the vernal equinox.
Get it as
Now,
close to...
yeah, and it becomes much more technical than that, but basically Easter tied to the vernal equinox.
All right.
That year, the vernal equinox was on March 21. Now, that was in 325,
Okay.
Council of Nicaea. By the time of the Council of Trent, which is
1,200 years later.
1500, well, it's 1200 years later, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. There had been now an accumulation of those additional days over that period. So actually, 10, I forget if it was 10 or
Yeah, I
11
think 10.
additional days had skewed the calendar away from that vernal, had skewed the Easter date, I should say,
Okay.
away from that vernal equinox. So the Gregorian calendar, which Pope Gregory did in response to the request, really, of the Council of Trent, was to, first of all, erase those extra days, all right, and bring Easter back to
Conformity.
Yeah, exactly.
But
But,
no change of the weekly cycle.
oh no, there was no change in the weekly cycle.
No change of the days.
So like it went from the 10th to the 20th, that was right the very next day, but it was still Wednesday, Thursday.
The
or
numbers
whatever.
changed, but the weekly cycle.
Right.
And I bring that up because, you know, there are people who say, but the calendar's been changed. We can't know now. I mean, I know what the Bible says. I understand about Jesus and the Jews, but time has changed. Calendars have changed. But what you're suggesting, and how Holbrook will work this very well with part 1, is that, in fact, there's been no change in the cycle. Post-Gregorian calendar, which, by the way, are we on the Gregorian calendar? So we still are indebted to that
Well,
dead man.
unless you're a computer programmer that's calculating with dates, but
Yeah.
yes, because they still do use the Julian calendar for some things.
Do they really?
Sure, sure.
But the weekly cycle went on being adjusted by different societies. Tell me about some experiments with modern time moving away from the 7-day cycle.
A French Revolutionary calendar was the big deal.
Okay.
This was an anti-religion, anti-church thing.
Gotcha.
Right? So they really adopted the type of cycle that the Egyptians had used,
10-day cycle.
10-day cycles, which
Okay.
they actually called decades. And then because of the way they structured their year, like the Egyptian year had been structured with 12 30-day months, they came up at the end of the year. They ran out of calendar before they ran out of year. So then they have these extra days, all right, which we would call intercalary days. They don't appear anywhere they don't appear in the weekly cycle. They don't appear in the monthly cycles, all right? They're just extra days. They're free days. So they became feast days or holidays, you see?
But you've got to put them
Those-
somewhere.
you gotta
on
put 'em
your,
somewhere.
You know, I mean,
So that was the French calendar, the French Revolutionary calendar, but it was stated as it was described by those who propounded it.
Overt
initially
attempt.
As an attempt to simply get the French population away from its deep roots of course, at that time, in the Catholic faith and the repetition of this calendar, of this liturgical calendar.
Real quickly now, the Russians as well. Did a little experimenting?
Yeah, and this also was anti-religious. This was back around 1930.
Okay.
Right? And this was Stalin's attempt, actually, to make production more efficient. He had a 5-day continuous production calendar, and the production process was to operate every day using 80% of the workforce. People were divided up into 5 groups, identified by 5 different colors. Each day in the 5-day cycle, one of those groups was off, and the other 4 groups were working. All right, and that lasted only, I think, actually less than 2 years. And then they went to a 6-day calendar. But this was an attempt, again, to first of all, remove people away from the cycle, from the liturgical cycle. All right, get them away from church. It was also anti-family because it meant that a father and a mother might both be employed, probably were both employed. No guarantee that they're going to have the same day off. Their children are being raised by the state. So it was anti-family as well as anti-religion.
Here's a question, Pat. Outside of Holy Scripture, do we have evidence of other communities who had the same 7-day cycle that ends on a Sabbath?
We do have some evidence of it, and it appears that they got it from the Hebrews.
Really?
You remember, of course, Israel went into captivity to Babylon.
Right.
And they got scattered. I mean, Babylon scattered them to the farthest corners of the earth. They were sent to India, China. They were, they colonized other places. And we have some evidence that Confucius himself was aware of the Sabbath. He called it the culminating day. He said in one place that on that day of the week, the gates are closed and the merchants don't do their business. You know, and he mentions that several times, and there are authors who believe that the classics, the Chinese classics, understand and accept the 7-day cycle and even the Sabbath of the 7-day Sabbath. Buddhism too. There's some evidence that among monks in early Buddhism there was a 7-day Sabbath rest.
So when Jim was talking about going over to China, you talked about that at the beginning. I mean, that was why he wanted to be there to do some of that exploration.
Yeah, and most of what he was looking at was at a later date, closer to the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th century in China. But even in the writings of 10th and 11th century China, or even in the writings of 18th century China, there's a reference to the Sabbath being part of early Chinese culture.
Wow. So here we have the 7-day cycle, recorded, chronicled in history, as well as Scripture. You still, though, in the 3rd millennium, have people say, hey, wait a minute, look at the calendar in my day timer. And the first day of the week's Monday, and the last day of the week is Sunday. So I told you, it's all been changed.
And even aside from that, a lot of people think that Sunday is the 7th day of the week just because they go to church on Sunday, and they've heard the commandment in the back of their mind, the 7th day is a Sabbath, and they automatically assume that, oh, Sunday's the 7th day. But if they actually look at the calendar, I mean, Hal did that, He said, I always thought that Sunday was the 7th day of the week. And I said, well, have you looked at the calendar? He says, yeah, I went and looked at it, and it's just the opposite. Sunday's the 1st day of the week. He said it never occurred to me.
Let me just ask you a word about the experts. You have them in every part, but you had George Murphy, okay, clerical collar. What's up with that?
George Murphy is a Lutheran minister.
Okay.
Right? Teaches at one of their seminaries, I think in Ohio. But he is also a theoretical physicist. And it happened that he was on a sabbatical when we were doing part 1. And we were able to catch up with him. I think he was in Berkeley. And I approached him. We talked about the creation aspect of our project here, and about some biblical connections to the creation story and so forth. It was interesting. He agreed to do this on the condition that we allowed him to wear his clerical collar.
Yeah.
Because he said, I want to be understood as coming from my clerical background.
Probably because it would naturally be assumed that he's not a Christian being in that field.
Yeah.
And a rather unique kind of a combination, a scientist and a clergy person wrapped up in one individual.
Right.
And a delightful person, brilliant mind,
Oh, yeah.
weighs in on the subject. So you had George Murphy and Eskenazi. Now, what's the story on her?
Well, she's a professor at Hebrew Union College in LA.
Okay.
And I just loved her very personal view of the Sabbath. You know, she looks at it theologically, but she also looks at it so personally.
Let me put a wrap on part one with this question. You get into creation and evolution with Hal Holbrook in part one. What's the big deal about that? Why are you why'd you jump into that in part one?
Well, where does the Sabbath come from? You know, where's the very first Sabbath?
Story of
The
creation.
end of creation week.
Right.
You know, God worked 6 days, creating the seventh day, He kept holy. So we have the very first Sabbath as a memorial of that creation week. So it's important to us to lay the foundation for Sabbath in creation week. You know, and to point out that creation itself, you know, is symbolized by the Sabbath. God spoke the world into existence, and He also is capable of speaking a new heart into me. You know, His mighty creative work.
Because this is probably one of the most hotly contested areas of Christian interface with secular society. I mean, come on. Kansas School Board.
Sure.
The whole world knows about the Kansas School Board who votes ID, intelligent design, into their curriculum. So this is a hot issue. We can't avoid it. As you just pointed out, Pat, it's a part of the creation. It's a part of the creation story.
Dwight, if there had never been an evolutionist, if the Sabbath had been observed generally by the human race,
We never would have
there
had
never would have been an evolutionist.
You're right.
Because the Sabbath would be the
There
constant
wouldn't
reminder.
Darwinism wouldn't have existed.
That's right.
Communism wouldn't have existed.
Sure.
Because what is communism? Political atheism.
Sure.
Yeah. Fascinating, fascinating journey into Sabbath truth. And when we get to part two, I want to plunge into this continuity that moves beyond the covers of this book. We'll get to part two in just a moment.